All right, everybody, got a ton of bones here for you to practice with. I'm gonna try and mix up the order as much as possible. What I'll do is I'll hold up a bone and ask you, like, what are the brown bones? And then you want to try and pause it and answer and even write them down before I give you the answer, and then see if you can actually do it. Let's start with those brown bones. What bones are here? Hopefully you said the nasal bones. What bones are the blue ones? And on the practical, you could have any view of this. That's the maxillary bones. Let's switch it up. What bone is this? This would be the axis. And while we're on the axis, what feature is this? That's the odontoid process. And remember that this is also called C2, second cervical vertebra. What bone is this? Right here, this feature is the Foramen Magnum. Therefore, this is the occipital bone. What bone is this? It's a rib. The brown bones, back on the same little piece from before, what are these brown bones called? They're kind of orangey. They got 2 green dots on them. Those are the back of the roof of your mouth, so that's the palatine. They make up the palate. This bone. That's your frontal. This bone. Right in the eye there. Lacrimal bone. This bone. We'll say without this. What's this? This is the sacrum, so remember you find that at the bottom of your spine. And what would this little guy be? That is the coccyx or tailbone. On the practical, make sure you always use the scientific name. I would mark tailbone wrong. This bone. This is the ethmoid. Here is the cristagalli, the ridge with the cribriform plate. And then the perpendicular plate that helps divide your nose is right there. These 2 bones here. Those are the parietal bones. It's going to be hard the further I get to remember which bones I've already talked about and which ones I haven't. This bone. This is the sphenoid bone. And what's this feature called inside that I could almost stick my pinky in? Part of the brain sits in there. That is the sella turcica. This bone. It's the hyoid bone, and remember that your tongue anchors here. Orange bone, right here. Goes back here a little bit. That is the temporal bone, and we'll come back to those features later. This bone down here, scientific name, it's the mandible. And remember, this is the ramus, the bar, the body. What would these holes be called? They are the mental foramen. And now also remember, we've had body 3 times. So body here, we've had the body of the sternum and also the body of the vertebrae. Speaking of vertebrae, what section of the spine does this come from? Hopefully you said lumbar. Looks like a moose, big and blocky. And that green tag, what is this feature called? That's the spinous process. What's this feature called? That's the body. And how about these guys? Since they stick out to the side, transverse. And because they're projections, they stick out, these are the transverse processes. Remember, the spinous process is what you can actually feel down your back. This bone. This is the temporal. While we're on the temporal, what is this pointy thing called? That is the styloid process. White bone inside the eye, right here. That's the ethmoid bone. And notice we can also see it right here, cristagalli and cribriform plate. What's the red bone in here? You can also see it right there. This is a different red bone, by the way. That's the sphenoid bone. We can also see it from the bottom. What's that green bone back here? And we also see it down here. That's the vomer bone. What suture is this? So this is the front of the skull, and this is the back. This is the frontal bone. Here's the parietal bones. This is the coronal suture. What suture is this? Hopefully you said sagittal suture. Remember, 1G, 2 T's. What suture is this? This is the lambdoid suture. What feature is this hole? This is the external auditory meatus. You can also call it the external acoustic meatus. How about this bump? That's the mastoid process, and all these things are on the temporal bone. What is this? This is the zygomatic process because it goes to the zygomatic bone. Note the zygomatic arch, this rounded part, is a feature of the zygomatic bone. A lot of people had that wrong on the Google form when you had to fill that out. All right, next, trying to remember, like I said, the bones that I haven't done yet. I know I mentioned this feature before, but I didn't give you the chance to answer it. So what feature is this? That's the foramen magnum. What bone is this bottom curlicue in the nose? It's the inferior nasal conchae. What bone do the upper curlicues belong to? So these are the superior and the middle nasal conchae. You technically can only see the middle, the superior would be way back in there. But what bone do they belong to? Hopefully you said the ethmoid bone. What bone is this? Looks kind of creepy, like a bug. That's the frontal bone. What suture do we have here? That's the squamous suture. What bone is this? This is the atlas, or C1, because we already saw the axis and they fit together like this, so you can turn your head no, and your occipital bone fits here, so you can rock your head yes. How many vertebrae are in this section of the spine? So hopefully first you realize this is the giraffe kind of bone, and this is a thoracic vertebra. And if you think about times a day, 7, 12, 5, There are 12 of these. What bone is this? This is the sternum, and if you had to break it into its parts, this would be called the what? That's the manubrium. What part is this? That's the body. And what part is this? That is the xiphoid process. What bone is this? This is the vomer. What bone is this? That is the zygomatic bone. I'm trying to pull up another bone here. Okay. What section of the spine does this belong to? This is a cervical vertebra because of these two holes. So what are these two holes called? These are the transverse foramen. What's this hole called? Which I could point out on any of these. That's the vertebral foramen, and that's where the spinal cord runs through. All right, I think we got all the bones. If I missed any, I apologize. So again, sacrum, coccyx, rib, sternum, manubrium, body, xiphoid process. Just your quick little review here. Atlas, C1, axis, C2, they stack. Cervical, because of the holes. Thoracic, because it looks like a giraffe and it's skinny and this is really long. Lumbar, because it's thick and blocky and looks like a moose. Spinous process. Transverse process. Articular process, where the bones articulate on each other. Vertebral foramen. Transverse foramen. Body. This points backwards, and this is towards the front of your body, more anterior. Vomer. Zygomatic. Sphenoid. Ethmoid. Frontal. Occipital. Maxilla. Nasal. Palatine. Sphenoid with the sella turcica, ethmoid with the crista galli and cribriform plate has the perforations, occipital with the foramen magnum, vomer, green in the nose, inferior nasal conchae, middle superior nasal conchae, part of the ethmoid bone, nasal bones, maxilla, zygomatic, lacrimal, ethmoid, frontal, temporal, mandible, mental foramen, body, ramus, zygomatic process, zygomatic arch, external auditory or external acoustic meatus, styloid process, mastoid process, squamous suture, lambdoid suture, sagittal suture, coronal suture. Make sure you know about the sinuses and fontanelles and anything else that we've talked about in this as well. And then in ribs, don't forget we have true, false, and floating ribs. True ribs attach to the sternum by their own piece of cartilage here, or so up to here. The false ribs share a piece of cartilage and then attach. And then the floating ribs don't have any attachment to the sternum, but all of them attach to the vertebrae in the back in the thoracic region.